It just occurred to me that the forms that these materials might suggest to us might be much more exciting and radical than anything we could come up with ourselves. Any particular material will suggest a completely different world of form if you really listen. And to me, that seemed worthwhile. It seemed like something worth devoting a lifetime to. My name is Omer Arbel, and I designed the 75.9 house. This house is called 75.9 because it's the 9th iteration of the 75th idea that we've authored in our studio. We have a general philosophy in the studio, which is that form should be born of a material's intrinsic properties: glass, wood, and in this case, concrete. And so when our clients approached us, I said that that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to explore the sculptural potential of concrete in this kind of unpredictable way. In other words, to set in motion a way of making that we author without predicting what it might look like when finished. So I think it's a kind of amazing that they went for it because it's such a huge amount of risk. We've always had a critique of contemporary concrete construction, which is that it's a fluid, dynamic material, but those attributes of the material are never acknowledged in the finished forms that you see people making out of concrete. And we've been doing that at the scale of an object for many years. To bring that philosophy into the scale of architecture has been quite a challenge, but also just an amazing opportunity. It's almost like living with a very eccentric roommate or something like that. Like to try to make something that's not necessarily comfortable coexist within a comfortable home environment for a family. I thought that could make an exciting premise for architecture. In Vancouver, it rains 8 months of the year. It's really rainy. So we thought the experience of entry could be really wonderful if it was very lush. So the idea of what we're calling the winter garden is that it's very, very overgrown. You see it here in its infancy. That's sort of one idea about it. And the other one is that these things are not that far from being lily pads themselves. Above us is the first lily pad. And what you're looking at here is the dining room. So what you'll notice is that we've changed height. Space sort of explodes as soon as you enter, and then it intentionally gets low over the dining table. So that feeling of expanding and then contracting gives you an intimate feeling of the space, but also totally focused on the field. You're seated, you have this like very heavy thing above you, but your experience is thrown out into the sunset. We thought of forming it using fabrics. I'm not the first to explore this, but this is probably the first time the technique of fabric forming was explored at scale. It's almost like a reverse tent structure if you think of it. There are stiff parts like the tent poles, if to use that analogy, and then there's the soft parts, which are the fabric. And our role was to sculpt the forms such that it could, on the one hand, attain all these technical requirements that we had to respond to, but also to keep the process open-ended enough to surprise us, so that the form really responded to what the material wanted to do, not necessarily what we wanted it to do. One of the innovations of the method that we developed, and this came from our structural engineers, was to concoct the recipe for the concrete such that its rate of curing followed the rate of pouring the concrete very closely. So these took like 12 hours to pour or something like that on the one hand, and then have the speed of curing closely match that rate of pouring, such that the pieces attain structural integrity as the pour is happening. And also it allowed us to really trust the fabric formwork, because you can imagine that a lot of the hydrostatic tension no longer had to all fall on the one part of the stem that's closest to the ground, but was rather distributed over the entire length of the piece. One of the things I love and didn't really anticipate was the juxtaposition of, on the one hand, the weight of the concrete, something feeling so massive, especially above us, and on the other hand, something kind of pillowy and soft. I like to play with this idea of compression and expansion. So we have just been compressed in the dining room, and then we make our way to the living room and the space expands above us. again, sort of like in the direction of the westerly facing field. And so the sunset's very strong in this room. And you have a contrast between the height on the one hand and the horizontality of the site on the other. Given that these concrete pieces are so brutal and possibly uncomfortable, I felt that the contrast needed to be warmth. And that's why we really wanted oak. And I think that without the wood, it might make for an amazing cultural space or something like that. But as a home, it needed something to anchor it back into an experience that humans identify as comfortable. The sunsets over the fields are just sublime experiences. And so to orient most of the spaces such that they capture that magical west light and such that the windows could really sort of, almost as if you were in a ship and you were sort of seeing the horizon over the ocean, felt like the most poetic response to this site that I could come up with. And then east light, we treat it as a mysterious thing. It appears almost in all the spaces, but in a mysterious way and not directly. It's filtered, it comes in ambient. So that again is a contrast. I'm the creative director of a company called Bachi, and we make predominantly lighting. I made these sort of clouds, cloud forms. This particular piece is called 100, and it was new when this house was starting to come to the later stages of the construction project, and our clients fell in love with them. So my role was simply to compose how they might interact with the spaces. And in general, I like seeing lighting as a way to experience volumes that you can't really occupy with your body. Here we can see another intention which I had in the scenario of a gathering or a party. There would be people down here in the living room, but also up there in the outdoor dining room. So there is that idea of a second topography. And you're always passing sort of under or over the concrete lily pads. So we began by making small castings this big and then larger and larger, trying to prove the method. But what we learned very quickly is it doesn't really scale up. And so really the only way to do it is to try it at scale. And that was a kind of amazing thing to discover, is you can't really prepare. And one of the ways that we navigated that, let's call it trepidation, was to say, okay, let's just make one lily pad, a small one, and see how it goes. And so we made a small one, a 5-meter tall one, and it was successful. Everybody sort of believed in the idea after that. Our builder was fearless. And can you imagine just pouring all that concrete into basically a tent structure and just hoping for the best? It's like, it's wild. That's courage. This is the primary bedroom that opens out to the west, to the field. Right beyond here is the first concrete piece we made. It has a more awkward quality to it, and it's heavier, and it's more stretched out in its proportions. And it's beautiful because it's what proved that the method works. Now it's just part of the house. I wanted a more intimately scaled concrete piece in the place where you experience water. The quality of water and the liquid nature of these concrete works seemed compatible. We are in an outdoor zone right next to the primary bedroom, and because this is very private, it doesn't seem private, but it really is because you're surrounded by a field. The main shower is an outdoor shower, and the idea here was we just like tugged on the fabric a little bit to make that spout, and so the water falls from that little protrusion above. To bring in light into the buried portions of the house, we needed to sort of carve out these curved shapes. And so because it's a retaining wall, it made sense to build it out of concrete. And because we had developed this method, we thought to apply it to the surface of a wall. The pillored surface is a direct consequence of the hydrostatic pressure of the concrete. So wherever you have one of these, you had plywood rib, and then fabric is draped here. And as the concrete fills up, it pushes out and makes these sort of swells, pillow-like forms. A device that I used compositionally throughout the work was this idea that the concrete works were found objects. And they're not found. We made them. But it was a useful mental device to compose with, as if it were ruins of a 5,000-year-old structure that were discovered here. And then our role was to sort of encase them or exhibit them with the tools of contemporary architecture at our disposal. This idea of modernist forms or containers for the lily pads to inhabit, again, made sense to make them feel warm. We clad them in wood, but that also should suggest or hint at what's happening inside. We, in a very compositional, deliberate way, carved out window openings into those volumes. Through those, you see the concrete forms in the sort of cropped way, the same way you might crop a work of art or a photograph. The horizon is aggressive and relentless, and the sunset makes it even more sublime, but intense. And we felt like topography would modulate that experience and make it kind of rich, but not too aggressive. We draped the field over the house, which meant that there are these hills that berm over certain rooms. In this particular case, it's the corridor. Over there is the primary bedroom. And bringing light into those rooms required us to come up with some sort of method or device. And we did it by carving out these essentially light wells that could also be inhabited. So each one is a little courtyard, introducing an outdoor space that has intimacy and dimension in an otherwise vast and relentless horizon. The concrete lily pads are hollow because they are effectively planters for gigantic mature trees on the roof, or what will become gigantic trees. And so all that drainage from these enormous planters has to pass through these stems, and that means that they have to be hollow. It's a surreal moment. To have trees floating doesn't register that as logical in our minds. It's a dreamscape. I like inviting these moments of surrealism into the project, which you maybe don't even realize you're experiencing, but they give the experience of inhabitation a dreamlike quality. We have climbed up the stairs and now we're looking at the downstairs. So the two large pieces on both sides of the dining room are bathed in south light. You can see that there's a skylight surrounding 3 of the 4 faces. And the intent there is to make them feel like they're kind of floating and surrounded with a halo of sky. We are on top of the dining room lily pad. So this is the outdoor dining room. Imagine in your mind's eye this tree 30 years from now, much bigger and fuller. So here we see the intention of having this sort of secondary landscape. This is cedar, which is a material that's associated with this region. And it has the nice quality of silvering over time, which we thought was very beautiful when considered against the texture of the gray concrete and the gray clouds of Vancouver. We live in a world of one-size-fits-all solutions. We wear the same clothes and listen to the same music and eat the same food. And it's like, what if we developed forms that can't be repeated? These forms, if we were to repeat exactly the same process, would yield different results in another site. I find that interesting. I think that's meaningful.